lot of times we add interest and texture to our projects through the manipulation of stitches or maybe color, like in this doily I'm working on. Definitely a lot of interest added through the manipulation of stitches. But sometimes something as simple as adding some beads to your project can really add a lot of sparkle or some of those same qualities. Sometimes I add beads to just plain stockinette knitting projects or add a few to my embroidery to really, spruce it up. And if you don't want to add beads to your knitting as you're knitting, you can always start out by adding beads to the yarn that you're spinning, which is a lot of fun. And while I've got my beads out, let's make some knitting jewelry like stitch markers and progress keepers. To get started, let's talk about the easiest and not the easiest, but the most fundamental way to add beads to your projects is by adding them to your yarn. I have always coveted those beautiful sparkly hanks of lace weight yarn in the local yarn shop that have delicate sequins and little tiny glass beads attached, but those skeins carry a pretty hefty price tag. So I was interested in reproducing that kind of yarn and including those tiny delicate beads. And to do so, it's pretty simple. To make the process easier, I've got a bead spinner, and the purpose of a bead spinner is to, of course, spin the beads. And what that does is presses the beads flat up against the side, with the holes all aligned in one direction. So you can go in there with a curved hook or needle and just scoop those right up and quickly and easily string them onto a thread. I'm stringing them onto a thread because the idea is to use that thread with beads and ply it together with a couple of plies to create your beaded yarn. So I've pre-spun some plain singles, some white merino singles, and I've strung some beads on. What I'm using is just a regular cotton, poly cotton blended sewing thread. You can use all kinds of different threads or fibers if you want for your stringing material. Some people use a nylon cord. Other people will actually spin up a very fine singles for this purpose. But I figured I've got plenty of sewing thread in my stash, and it would add a little bit of strength to the finished yarn anyway, is the way I look at it. But I take the two plies or the two singles with my thread, my beaded thread, and tie it onto the leader of my spinning wheel. And then as I'm spinning along, I slowly, one at a time, feed a bead into the yarn. If you want more beads in your yarn, of course, you're going to slide the bead into the yarn more frequently. For me, I've added a bead probably every 10 inches or so. The resulting yarn is sparkly, but probably not as sparkly as I'd like. So if I was to do this yarn over again, I would probably add a bead every 3 to 4 inches. And when you're stringing your beads onto your thread, I would go for more than you think you need, because it's easy at the end of your spinning project to take the excess beads and put them back in the little box of beads. It's more difficult if you run out of beads to add more. You'll definitely have to cut the thread, string more onto the thread, and then tie the new thread on. Not difficult or impossible to do, but a little bit of a pain to do in the middle of your project. the end result is a beautiful sparkly yarn. The beads I chose were glass with silver lining, and I think it looks like my yarn has dewdrops on it. I'm really excited to knit this up and see what it looks like in a finished knitted piece. There is a second way that I know of getting beads onto your yarn as you're spinning, and that is by stringing beads onto bits of fiber and then spinning those bits of fiber into your yarn. This requires a really tiny hook and a lot of patience as you string the beads onto your fluff and create quite a pile, and then spin the fiber into your singles. I think this technique is really effective if you're going for a bulkier yarn or an art yarn and you're using heftier beads. I found that for the delicate beads that I'm using and the lace weight I was intending, it wasn't really working for me, because adding the little bits of fluff to my really thin singles produced a thick, thin yarn. The end result worked. I have beads on my singles, but I really prefer more consistency in my yarn. I think this technique would be beautiful for something with chunky, colorful yarn, chunky, colorful beads, and I fully intend on trying this method again in the future. If you're working with a yarn that doesn't have beads pre-strung in it, you can always add the beads as you're knitting. It does require a very tiny hook, a 0.75 millimeter hook, and some patience, because you do stop in the middle of your knitting to remove a stitch and add a bead with a hook. And I use size 8 beads. If you don't know what a size 8 bead is, it's usually written on the package. And when you're planning a design on your sock or whatever knitting you have in mind, I like to place beads in a checkerboard pattern, not right next to each other so they don't rub against each other or distort the knitting. And you can use sometimes Fair Isle motifs in order to build a picture or gain inspiration for what you want to put on your sock. For these, I just put a row of diamonds. It was kind of argyle sock inspired, although a tiny little diamond argyle pattern. And I think the little extra sparkle really goes a long way. When I add beads to a project, a knitting project, I tend to add them to a yarn that already requires hand washing, so I don't have to worry about their care. I would not want to put these glass beads through a washer and dryer cycle because they are prone to breaking if they're slamming around the metal barrel of your dryer. So if you put them on hand wash, you know, you don't even have to think about it, and they won't accidentally, hopefully accidentally, end up in the dryer. Not only do beads add sparkle and texture to your knitted and crocheted items, they can also add a lot of sparkle and color to your embroideries as well. I love creating what I call hoop art, especially art that's centered around some kind of inspirational saying or phrase. They make wonderful gifts, and they take a couple hours to make, and they're really cherished by the recipients. I've started adding beads to my embroidered pieces recently, and I just love the way it elevates them and makes them a little glamorous. A lot of these are free form. Don't be intimidated. It's really easy to create these. You can start with a sketch, or for me, I start out with the words. I'll write the words out on a piece of paper that's a little bit see-through, and the reason I use this see-through paper is so I can flip it over and trace it on the reverse side with an iron-on transfer pen. Once you have that iron-on transfer ink on the back of the paper, it's easy to then iron and transfer whatever design or words you have onto your fabric. For the words, I usually use black and I just outline them. And then the rest is just a floral design to encircle the words. My favorite design or my favorite element to put on one of these embroideries is what I think is called a spider flower. And the reason it's called a spider flower is it starts out with what looks like the beginnings of a spider web. You need an odd number of legs. I usually choose 5, and then I just weave all around those legs. The key here is to not pull tight. If you leave your weaving loose, it more accurately represents the petals of a flower. Once I get the flowers in, then I go back with a few different stitches to create the greenery. I use what I think is called a chain stitch, but I could be wrong, to create the leaves. And for the feathery plants to the right of the embroidery, I believe this is called a feather stitch, but do not quote me on that. And once I have my flowers in place and my greenery in place, it's just a matter of using a single strand of floss to add the beads. Now to finish these little embroideries, I really like to stain the hoops. I get the hoops, I think they're willow hoops, from Michael's, AC Moore, Joann's, wherever. They're usually less than $2 a piece. And I like to display my embroidery in the hoop, but adding a little bit of stain to the hoop or a little bit of paint really takes it to the next level. And it takes 5 minutes to do so. And then for hanging it on the wall, it's as simple as adding a piece of ribbon that matches the threads in your embroidery. And if you're giving these as gifts, I think it's nice to finish the back off. And there's a couple of ways to finish the backs. Sometimes I cut the fabric close on the back of the hoop, glue it to the inside of the hoop, cut a piece of felt to the same size and then glue the felt down. You can also, you can't see it here, but I will run a stitch or a thread through the inside of the linen, cinch it so it lies flat. And then take a piece of fabric and do a decorative stitch around to secure it to the back. And again, this is nice if you're giving these as gifts, but not necessary. You don't have to do it if you're gonna hang it on your own wall. And when you hang these in little groupings, they really, really are a nice handmade touch to your home. So while you have your beads out, let's say you have some bulkier beads or some novelty beads. I get a lot of my novelty beads on places like Etsy or eBay. My favorite are little ceramic figurine beads. They're like little sculptures that you can put into your knitting jewelry. Now there are a lot of different ways people make knitting jewelry, but I'll show you how I make mine. To start, I string the beads onto a pin. Then I make a loop in the wire above the stack of beads around my round nose pliers. When the loop is formed, I thread on a lobster claw. To secure the progress keeper, the excess wire is wrapped around as tightly as I can get it. Excess wire is snipped off, and I make sure it lays flat so it won't snag my yarn. That's it, ready to use. Stitch markers are made much the same way as progress keepers, but instead of a lobster claw, I use a ring. So I string the beads, make a loop in the wire, and then I thread on a ring. I prefer the soldered rings, although they're a little harder to find. Wrap the wire around. snip the end. Make sure it's secure and snug. And that's it, ready to use. It requires just a few tools and a few supplies, and it adds a lot of whimsy and fun to your projects as you're working on them. Speaking of texture and interest in your projects, designer Mina Phillip has a new pattern called Snow Day, which has tons of texture and color. If you are interested in a chance at winning this pattern from Mina, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below with your Ravelry name. I will randomly select a winner and send that pattern to your Ravelry account. Well, as always, thank you so much for joining me, and until next time.